The last time a human being traveled this far from Earth, they were trying not to die. That was 1970. An oxygen tank had exploded mid-mission. The moon landing was canceled. 3 men were simply fighting to make it home alive. That desperate detour, taken in a broken spacecraft, in the middle of a crisis, set a record. The farthest any human being had ever traveled from their home planet. It stood for 56 years, a moon mission record that no crew, no program, and no generation had touched. Then, on April 1st, 2026, Artemis II launched. After more than 50 years, humans were going back, and they were about to break that record. The man whose record they were breaking had recorded a message for this crew before he died. What he said is the part of this story you need to hear. To understand why that record mattered, you have to go back to one moment in December 1972. Gene Cernan was the last person to walk on the moon. He had spent 3 days on the surface. 3 days in a place no human being had any right to be, driving across lunar dust, collecting rocks, looking up at a sky with no clouds and no air and no sound. When it was finally time to leave, he walked back toward the lunar module, stopped at the bottom of the ladder, and looked back one final time. Then he said, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return." The hatch closed, the engine fired, and no human being left for deep space again. NASA's budget was cut. The space race with the Soviet Union was over. The political will to keep going quietly disappeared. The massive rockets were retired. The launch pads went quiet. Every astronaut after Cernan stayed in low Earth orbit, close to home, safe, never once pushing toward the moon. 53 years passed. An entire generation was born, grew up, had children of their own, and grew old, without ever watching a human crew fly toward the moon. The idea started to feel less like a paused mission and more like something that had simply ended. In 2017, NASA started building again. They called it Artemis, named after the goddess of the moon and the twin sister of Apollo. The name was not chosen by accident. This was not a new program. It was a continuation of something that had been set down mid-sentence. Artemis I launched in November 2022 with no crew on board. A test flight. Every system on the new Orion capsule and the Space Launch System rocket was checked under real conditions. Everything worked. The road was open. But a test with no people on it does not change history. So 4 astronauts were chosen. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian, the first non-American ever selected for a lunar mission. Together they named their capsule Integrity, not as a marketing choice, as a statement about what it took to get there. On April 1st, 2026, the rocket ignited at Kennedy Space Center. The ground shook under the feet of everyone watching. The sky split open. For the first time in 53 years, a human crew left Earth and headed for the moon. But there was a number waiting for them in the dark. April 11th, 1970. Apollo 13 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center, carrying Commander Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. Their goal was the moon. Their plan was a landing. Everything was on schedule. 2 days in, at 55 hours and 54 minutes into the mission, an oxygen tank inside the service module exploded. A loud bang shook the capsule. Warning lights flooded the instrument panel. Power began to drop. Lovell looked out the window and saw a trail of gas venting into space. The moon landing was canceled immediately. Lovell looked at his crew. Getting home alive was the only mission now. To get back, they powered down the command module to save energy, moved into the small lunar module, and swung around the far side of the moon. They used the moon's own gravity to slingshot them back toward Earth. That emergency path carried them 248,655 miles from home, the farthest any human had ever been from their planet. They made it back, all 3 of them. But the distance they covered in desperation, on a broken ship, during a mission that nearly killed them, became the record. and it stood for 56 years. Artemis II crossed that number before it even reached the moon. The moon does not travel in a perfect circle around Earth. It moves in an oval. Some months it swings closer. Other months it drifts farther away. In April 2026, the moon was near the far end of that oval, making the journey out longer than any Apollo mission had ever flown. So the distance from Earth kept climbing on the way there. 249,000 miles, 250,000, 251,000. On April 6, 2026, the Orion capsule passed 248,655 miles. The Apollo 13 record was gone. The crew kept going. Final distance reached 252,756 miles. More than 4,000 miles past where Apollo 13 had been pushed in a crisis 56 years earlier. Then the capsule flew behind the moon. All contact was lost. No signal, no voice. For 40 minutes, Mission Control heard nothing. The crew of Integrity was on the far side of the moon, completely cut off. In a silence no human crew had experienced since December 1972. The world waited. Then the signal came back. If this is your first time here, subscribe. Every story on this channel is told this way. The full picture. The detail that changes everything. Now, back to the mission. Earlier that same morning, before the far side pass, Mission Control had played the crew a recorded message. It was from Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13, the man whose record Artemis II had just broken. Lovell had recorded it months before he died. He passed away on August 7, 2025, at 97 years old. He spent the last years of his life watching the Artemis program slowly come together, knowing that one day a crew would pass the distance his broken spacecraft had once been forced to reach. He never got to see it happen in person, but he made sure his voice would be there when it did. His words came through the speakers inside the capsule. "Hello, Artemis II. This is Apollo astronaut Jim Lovell. Welcome to my old neighborhood." There was also something physical on board. An Apollo 8 mission patch that Lovell had personally carried to the moon in December 1968. That was the mission that first took humans around the far side of the moon. 58 years later, that same patch was flying again, inside the capsule of the crew that had just passed him. Commander Wiseman spoke quietly after the message played. "It is just a real honor to have that on board with us." Victor Glover, the first person of color to travel this far from Earth. Christina Koch, the first woman. Jeremy Hansen, the first non-American. They had gone farther than any human beings before them, and they had carried the man whose record they broke right alongside them. Apollo 13's record was never supposed to be a record. It was the distance 3 men had to cover just to survive. Artemis II's distance was a choice. 4 people going as far as they decided to, because humanity was finally ready to go again. Cernan said they would return. The world moved on. Lovell grew old. The engineers who built the Saturn V passed away one by one, taking with them the knowledge of what it once took to leave Earth behind. But Lovell recorded a message before he went. And on April 6, 2026, his voice traveled 250,000 miles from Earth and played inside a capsule built by the generation that came after him. The 56-year record is broken, and the story that went quiet in December 1972 is finally moving again. Jim Lovell never got to watch this happen in person, but his voice was there when it did. Tell me in the comments, what does that mean to you? And if you want more stories told this way, subscribe. The next one is already waiting.